Two oil shocks at once. The energy crisis nobody is talking about. 13 million barrels a day have disappeared from global oil markets. Let that land for a second. 13 million. Gone. Every single day. That is more crude than the United States, the single largest producer on Earth, pumps out of its shale fields in an entire 24-hour cycle. It is the production of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait combined, wiped off the map. If you lined up the supertankers needed to carry that lost volume around the globe, they would stretch halfway across the Atlantic. And here is the part that should keep you up at night. Oil is trading at $101. Wall Street is drinking champagne over a fragile ceasefire. Financial news anchors are arguing about whether the crisis is already behind us. The word you keep hearing is resilience. You hear it in earnings calls. You hear it in central bank press conferences. You hear it from analysts who have not set foot on a tanker since they graduated. It is a lie, a very expensive lie. Because beneath the polished headlines, two separate supply shocks are unfolding at the same time, in the same corridor of water, and they are colliding into something the International Energy Agency has now labeled, in its own words, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Worse than 1973, worse than 1979, worse than Ukraine in 2022. In fact, worse than those three events combined. The IEA does not throw superlatives around for fun. This is the same agency that spent the last decade writing cautious, dry, bureaucratic reports. When they write worst in history, the world should probably stop scrolling. So the question is simple. If the shock is historic, why is the oil price acting like nothing happened? Who is pricing what, and who is going to pay when the curtain finally drops? Buckle up, because the gap between the chart and reality is about to close. Hard. And the closing is not going to be gentle. Part 1. How we got here. To understand why this matters, you need to picture one narrow strip of seawater, 21 miles wide at its tightest point, no deeper than the length of a football field. That is the Strait of Hormuz. On a normal quiet Tuesday, roughly 20 million barrels of crude glide through that corridor, 1/5 of everything the world consumes. Add to that a third of the planet's liquefied natural gas, a third of global helium production, fertilizer trade, methanol, naphtha, an entire economic bloodstream funneled through a passage shorter than the commute between Manhattan and Newark. If that choke point shuts down for a week, the world shrugs. If it shuts down for a month, governments start scrambling. If it shuts down for 2 months, you are looking at the global economy in the 1970s playing out in fast forward, with an extra tech sector accelerant thrown in for good measure. Now picture that corridor, today, choked down to less than 4 million barrels. A 78% collapse in throughput. Insurance premiums on tanker transits have jumped from roughly 0.125% of hull value to somewhere between 0.2 and 0.4% per crossing, and that is when captains are willing to go at all. More than 150 vessels are anchored outside the choke point, waiting for a window that refuses to open. Some ship owners are paying crews double hazard wages. Others have simply rerouted to Fujairah and Yanbu, adding thousands of miles to every voyage and stressing pipeline capacity that was never designed for that volume. The trigger was a war. In late February, the Trump administration announced major military operations against Iran, joined by Israeli strikes. Within hours, Iran's Revolutionary Guard forbade passage to any vessel headed to a U.S., Israeli, or Allied port. By March the 4th, they claimed complete control of the strait. Tankers were burning. Tugboats were sinking. Ships named Skylight, Safine Prestige, Mayuri Nari became names you suddenly heard on financial television. The footage of the Mayuri Nari catching fire with 3 crew killed was the kind of image that used to freeze markets for weeks. This time, it barely made the second page. Iran's military did not stop at warning shots. The IRGC used 4 separate methods to strangle traffic: boat swarms, missile and drone strikes, naval mines planted from March 10th onward, and GPS spoofing combined with satellite interference that left captains literally unable to trust their own navigation screens. The U.S. Navy began mine clearance operations on April 11th. On April 4th, an American submarine sank the Iranian frigate Iris Dina, killing 238 sailors. This is not a skirmish. This is a modern naval war in the single most important energy corridor on Earth. Here is where the narrative gets misleading, though. On April 8th, both sides announced a ceasefire. Markets cheered. Brent dropped from $128 a barrel to the mid-90s in a week. Traders called it over. Anchors moved on to earnings season. But the ceasefire was a political document, not a physical one. Iran's parliament speaker said it plainly. Reopening Hormuz is impossible as long as the U.S. blockade stands. On April 17th, Tehran said the strait was open. On April 18th, Tehran closed it again. On April 22nd, two commercial ships, the Epaminondas and the MSC Francesca, were seized by Iranian forces. Traffic is still near zero. Saudi Arabia has cut output by 20%. Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates have declared force majeure on their contracts. Those facilities did not stop burning because politicians held a press conference. And the 5 largest container lines in the world, Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, and others, quietly suspended every planned transit weeks ago. This is the key. The physical shock is still unfolding. The market is pricing a peace that does not exist. Part 2. The Revelation. 2 shocks. 1 column of water. Here is the part nobody is saying out loud. This is not one crisis. It is 2 oil crises and a gas crisis, stacked on top of each other, sharing the same broken pipes. Shock number 1 is the crude barrel. The International Energy Agency estimates that 11 million barrels per day of oil production capacity has been shuttered. Saudi production fell from 10 million barrels a day to roughly 8. Iraq dropped from above 4 million to 1.57. The United Arab Emirates is at 2.37, more than a million below target. 80 energy facilities across the region took damage during the hostilities. Not warning shots, not scratches. Damage that requires 18 months to 2 years of reconstruction, even after the last missile falls. Saudi Aramco's giant Abqaiq stabilization plant, the Ras Tanura export terminal, Kuwaiti gathering stations, and the Upper Zakum fields in the UAE all took hits that will drag on output quarter after quarter. Shock number 2 is liquefied natural gas. On March 18th, Iran struck the Ras Laffan complex in Qatar. That single facility produces a meaningful slice of global LNG. Within hours, Qatar Energy declared force majeure. 17% of Qatari LNG capacity went offline. Asian spot prices jumped 140%. Dutch TTF benchmarks, the European gas contract, doubled from 30 euros per megawatt hour to above 60. Asian LNG spot prices climbed to $20.80 per million British thermal units, up more than 80% from August levels. The repair timeline for the damaged cryogenic trains is 3 to 5 years, not months, years. And the 2 shocks are not independent, they are multiplicative, because the same LNG that heats European homes is the same molecule that fertilizer plants need as feedstock. When fertilizer prices jump 40%, global food prices follow. When helium supply drops because the gas facilities that separate it are offline, semiconductor fabs slow production. Data centers, smartphones, cars, all downstream. 1/3 of global helium comes from the Gulf. Tungsten prices have already surged more than 50% in March. Aluminum is up 8%, and the Gulf produces roughly 9% of the world's supply of that metal too. Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, said this episode constitutes the greatest global energy security challenge in history. Not one of the largest, the largest. The 1973 and 1979 oil crises each wiped out roughly 5 million barrels per day. This one has eliminated more than 11 million barrels of oil, plus the equivalent of 140 billion cubic meters of natural gas. The Ukraine gas shock in 2022 removed 75 billion cubic meters.